Back in 1857, a firestorm swept across India. This was an event so massive it would forever change the course of history, not just for India, but for the entire British Empire. We're not just talking about a battle here. This was a genuine turning point. Okay, let's dive right in and unpack the incredible story of the Great Uprising of 1857.
So first things first, what do you even call this thing? You'll hear some people call it the Sepoy Mutiny, which really zeroes in on the soldiers who started it. Others call it a Great Uprising, and for many in India, it's nothing less than the first war of independence. The fact that it has so many names, well, that tells you right away just how complex and deeply significant this moment in history really is.
The explosion, the spark, really kicked off on May 10, 1857. But this fire wasn't lit overnight. The best way to think about it is like a giant powder keg. For almost 100 years, the British had been adding gunpowder, little by little, through policies and actions that pushed the people of India right to their breaking point. So today, we're going to unpack exactly what was in that powder keg, piece by piece. All right, first up, the political fuel. This was all about the British East India Company's systematic plan to just dismantle the power of local Indian rulers and grab complete control for themselves.
And this is where you can really see their strategy in action. It wasn't just one thing. It was kind of like a three-pronged attack. First, you had the straightforward wars, like the Battle of Buxar, which gave them a huge chunk of territory. Then they got a bit more subtle with something called the Subsidiary Alliance. This was a pretty clever and sneaky deal where Indian rulers had to accept a British official at their court and pay for British troops, which basically meant they were signing away their independence. And, if that didn't work, the British would just find an excuse, any pretext, to take over a kingdom, like they did with Alwad, claiming it was being misgoverned.
But wow, out of all of them, this one might be the most infamous, the Doctrine of Lapse. The rule was just brutal and simple. If an Indian ruler died without a direct, biological male heir, his kingdom was just gone. It lapsed and was taken over by the British. This completely spit in the face of the age-old Indian tradition of adopting an heir. And make no mistake, this wasn't just some dusty old rule on a piece of paper. They used it, and they used it ruthlessly. Major kingdoms like Satara, Nagpur, and of course the famous kingdom of Jhansi were all just swallowed up by the British using this exact policy. You can just imagine the absolute fury this created among the Indian nobles, watching their power, their history, their entire kingdoms just get erased. And then you've got the ultimate insult, right? This was aimed right at the heart of Indian sovereignty, the Mughal emperor himself, Bahadur Shah II. The disrespect was so personal. First, they took his name off the coins. Then, they announced that his kids and grandkids wouldn't be allowed to use the historic Red Fort or even call themselves emperors. At the end of the day, this wasn't just about land, it was about systematically humiliating India's political identity.
Okay, so that's the political powder. Let's add the next layer, because this is where it gets really personal for a lot of people. The deep-seated social and religious tensions. A real fear started to spread that the British weren't just after land, but after their very culture and faith.
And this right here is such a perfect example of that culture clash. The British brought in what they saw as major social reforms. They abolished sati, the practice of a widow burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre, and they made it legal for widows to remarry. Now, from their point of view, these were moral, progressive moves. But for a lot of conservative Indians, this was seen as a completely outrageous attack on their sacred traditions and a threat to their entire social order.
And underneath all of this was just this raw attitude of racial superiority. British officers were often incredibly arrogant, and they made it crystal clear they thought they were a master race. This quote really says it all. They called Muslims cruel and unfaithful. This kind of constant humiliation just created this deep, simmering resentment across the board.
And this all fed into a massive fear, a fear of being forced to convert to Christianity. I mean, look at how it built up over time. In 1813, Christian missionary work just skyrockets. Then English classes start popping up in traditional religious schools. But the final straw for many was this Religious Disability Act in 1850. It basically changed Hindu inheritance law, so that if you converted to Christianity, you could still inherit your family's property, which was a huge no-no before. To many Indians, this looked like proof positive of a secret British plan to convert them all.
All right, now we get to the stuff that hit practically everyone, from the poorest farmer to the soldier in the barracks. We're talking about the economic and military grievances. This was about money, resources, and just plain respect.
So this chart shows something called the drain of wealth. And honestly, that name is spot on. India was basically being bled dry. All the valuable raw materials, the taxes collected from the people, even the massive salaries paid to British officials, it was all being shipped off to England. And what did India get back in return? As you can see, almost nothing. It was a completely one-way street of exploitation.
And it wasn't just about taking resources, it was about actively crushing India's own industries. They slapped these huge taxes on Indian-made goods, beautiful silks and cottons, while at the same time they let British factory-made goods flood the market with super low taxes. The result? India's world-famous artisans and weavers were totally ruined, leading to massive unemployment and poverty. Which brings us to the army, the very people the British were relying on to control the country. And this chart, this chart says it all. An Indian soldier, a sepoy, was paid up to 8 times less than a British soldier for doing the exact same job. On top of that, their housing was terrible, their food was worse, the discrimination was just out in the open for everyone to see.
And it wasn't just the terrible pay. A whole bunch of new rules felt like personal attacks. The General Service Enlistment Act meant they could be forced to serve overseas, which for many high-caste Hindus was a huge taboo that could get them kicked out of their caste. They knew they could never get promoted to a high rank. And then, the Post Office Act of 1854 took away their free mail service, which was a huge deal for sending letters home to their families. It was just one insult after another.
So, the revolt is eventually crushed, and with just, brutal force. But it was a massive wake-up call for Britain. The powder keg had finally exploded, and the relationship between them and the people of India would never, ever be the same. This leads to what we now call the new British Raj.
So what's the single biggest change to come out of all this? Well, it's the end of the East India Company's rule. The British government basically decided that a private company couldn't be trusted to run an entire subcontinent anymore. So power was transferred directly to the British Crown. The Governor-General was replaced by a viceroy, who was the Queen's personal representative in India.
The British also completely switched up their playbook. They got rid of really unpopular policies like the Doctrine of Lapse, but they picked up a new, and you could say much more dangerous strategy: divide and rule. See, during the revolt, they saw Hindus and Muslims fighting side by side against them. So after that, they made it their mission to stir up tensions between the two groups to make sure they'd never unite again.
And this new system, well, it pretty much sealed the deal for the old aristocracy. Even before the revolt, policies like the Inam Commission had led to the confiscation of something like 20,000 estates from traditional landlords. The new Raj wasn't about to give those back.
But here's the thing. Militarily, yeah, it was a failure. But in terms of the story of India, it created a whole new chapter. People like Mangal Pandey, one of the very first soldiers to rebel, Nana Sahib, and the legendary Rani of Jhansi, they all became national heroes. Their stories of sacrifice would inspire generations of freedom fighters to come.
And at the end of the day, that might be the most important legacy of all. For really the first time, you had people from totally different regions, religions, and social classes all fighting together against a common enemy. Even though they lost, the Revolt of 1857 forged this new sense of a shared Indian identity that hadn't really existed before. It was the violent, bloody birth of Indian nationalism.
Which brings us to one last, big question for you to think about. Militarily, sure, the revolt was defeated. But by ending the rule of a corporation, by forcing the British to completely change their policies, and by creating the very idea of a unified India fighting for its freedom, did it truly fail? That's something worth thinking about.